and welcome back to your committee program. I'm your host, Arun Chaudhry, and we have a very special deep dive with committee's own Julia Doubleday on COVID, the ongoing pandemic. In fact, one of the things I was struck by when speaking to this with Julia the other day was she was quoting someone, and maybe you can even start here by talking to us about sort of this moment that we're at, of someone saying it's so strange how more people are dying now than they were during this certain stage of the pandemic. And you're like, that defies the logic of words.
So what she actually said was, this was a mommy blogger article about how, oh my God, my kids have been sick over and over and over again. The kind of thing that really should be raising red flags for parents, but they're being told this is totally normal. They've really bought into this scientifically inaccurate, incorrect misinformation, which is so-called immunity debt. I will really dive deep into that and how it's not a thing. So if you have been explaining away your children's ongoing continual sickness with the idea that they're just getting sick because they didn't get sick last year, again, not real, not true. No immunologists are behind this quote unquote theory, which has no scientific evidence behind it. But there is tons and tons of scientific evidence behind the idea of post-COVID immune deficiency, which we are seeing confirmed over and over again all around the world. And the fact that that's not being communicated to the public is pretty clearly to continue to defend the status quo where we're all it's just normal. It's just normal. We're all going to be fine with 500 to 1,000 to 2,000 people dying in this country every single day of this disease. And it's really criminal. But yes, so
let's situate folks. Folks.
Sorry.
So one of the reasons that even we're having a bigger than normal kind of, not just a closing statement where I say, hey, we're on hiatus and we're not doing a new season and we're shutting down the Patreon and all of those scary, horrible things. The reason we're actually doing a much bigger program around this is also to promote your next venture, which is a Substack that you are primarily writing about misinformation, bad science, bad policy, and bad outcomes with COVID and the ongoing pandemic. And so you have written 3 articles for your Substack, which, please feel free to plug it as much as you want. But what are the subjects of those? Why are you picking this? Where are we at now? And forget all the scorekeeping, right? There's as you say, there's all this politics, there's all this sort of, people putting their political lives in front of people's actual lives. Just situate us in reality of the moment that we're in.
Yes.
For someone who's maybe not paying attention and isn't interested in the scorekeeping part.
Yes, it's really important for us to get back to reality and engage with what the science is finding. Before I launch into a little bit about the Substack, I just want to say that, I know that I'm a random person online. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an immunologist, but I am listening to those people. I am listening to the researchers and the experts. And if you have not been looking into the studies coming out about the long-term effects, the post-COVID effects, and the cumulative effects of COVID infection, I don't know why you would think that you have a better handle on what's going on than people who are doing those things. So you need to really reflect seriously about where you're getting the idea that COVID is safe to contract. And if the place you're getting that idea is from Joe Biden or New York Times journalists who are hell-bent on getting people back in the office for ideological reasons, please take the time to go on PubMed and look at the actual studies, because this stuff is not even controversial anymore. We know this is a very dangerous disease. But so let me tell you a little bit about the Substack. It's called The Gauntlet. I chose that name both because a gauntlet is, something that is a period of trial, but it's also something you throw down to challenge people. And I really felt that we need to throw down the gauntlet at this administration, at the left press, at everyone who has abandoned solidarity with disabled people, vulnerable people, not to mention participating in normalizing a status quo where vulnerable people are not safe to leave their homes. This is completely unacceptable. It is completely contrary to our values. And by the way, the average daily deaths this week in the US are at 500 per day. It has never been the flu. It's still not the flu. And the majority of people dying right now are vaccinated. So please don't buy into this pandemic of the unvaccinated. It's not true. Many older people, vulnerable people are still dying in the acute phase, which is not the only thing we need to worry about with COVID. So the Gauntlet, I have 3 articles up right now, like you mentioned. The first one is sort of throwing down the gauntlet at Joe Biden. It's just about how Joe Biden very dramatically did a ceremony right before he was sworn into office, the night before his inauguration. They lit candles all around the reflecting pool, 400 candles to commemorate 400,000 people who died of COVID under Trump. And we all agreed that this was a huge disaster. And at that time, I was a bit uncomfortable with it because I felt that it was a lot of showmanship and potentially sort of using these people as political props. But I hoped that I would be proven wrong and that they would have a really strong pandemic response. In fact, they were cynically using those dead people as political props, which is incredibly shameful in and of itself. Since Biden has taken office, 700,000 more people have died. I want to remind you that Joe Biden, while campaigning for office, declared that because 220,000 Americans had died on Trump's watch, Trump had no place in office and should resign, and that anyone who oversees that kind of death in that time period should resign. So by his own logic, he should have resigned 3 times by now. I want to also say that, well, yes, Biden has been in office much longer than Trump. That death toll is almost twice Trump's death toll. So if you actually break out like the average daily deaths by months that they were in office, under Trump, I think it was like 40,000 a month. And under Biden, it's like 30 to 35,000 a month. So we have not seen any kind of significant reduction in that acute phase death toll. Contrary to what we've been told, it continues to rise apace. And again, as much as I hear people saying, oh, well, now it's just a flu, I am very curious what metric they're using to determine it's just a flu. Because even in that acute phase, it's still killing 10 times more people than a flu would. So I think we're on track to have between 250,000 to 300,000 deaths in the US by the end of the year. A bad flu season might get up to 30,000. So it's nowhere near anything similar to what flu does. Even after the vaccination. The second article I wrote about, it's called Influential People, and I wrote it about a doctor who is also a part of the COVID response in Canada. I'm trying to remember which province it was. I think it might have been British Columbia, but they are having a really, really, really severe pediatric hospital crisis in Canada. This is starting to happen everywhere. It is happening in the US. We have these concurrent RSV, flu, hand, foot, and mouth, COVID, of course, all of these concurrent massive, massive waves. And actually, if Jack can share that, there's a graphic that I have that shows how many kids are hospitalized right now in Canada versus previous years. So if you're looking at this graph, what you see is that this cannot be explained by immunity debt. It cannot be explained by a sort of double cohort theory. We're well beyond 2 or 3 times the number of children in the hospital that we've ever seen before, and it's still rising. So that has also led to 48-hour wait times in pediatric emergency rooms, which I think is fair to say that's a collapse of the healthcare system. That's no longer a healthcare system in crisis. That is a system that is not operational, because if you go to an ER and you cannot get seen for 45 hours, that means you're not in an ER. You're not getting emergency medical care. Just a few days ago, a 2-year-old died on the floor in an emergency room. There were no beds. He died of the flu. And I want to be clear that people with healthy immune systems, children with healthy immune systems, do not die of the flu and strep throat. But that is what is happening right now. So in British Columbia, 6 children are dead of the flu so far this season. It is December 9th. In a typical flu season, they might have 1 death in the entire year. So we infected these kids with COVID with no idea. of the long-term effects, and we're seeing those long-term effects come home to roost, and people are very reluctant to engage with it or acknowledge it, but it is well demonstrated in the scientific literature at this point that yes, COVID damages your immune system and your resistance to all other pathogens. Additionally, this strep A, sorry, let me just finish the strep A outbreak in the UK has now killed 16 children. Yesterday, it was 15. A few days before that, it was 9. Children, healthy children, do not die of strep throat. They have the immune systems of someone with a severely compromised ability to fight infections. So this article just followed a doctor up there who gave a speech on TV, and he really encouraged people to wear masks. No mandate, because that's not politically possible. But can you please just wear a mask because of all the children dying? Like, maybe think about it. That night, he went to a holiday gala for influential people, and he was on the list of influential people for his role in fighting COVID, and he had no mask on. So, you know, it's very disgusting for me to watch someone do that, knowing what he knows about what's happening to children. Sorry, but did you have something you wanted to?
I just wanted you to unpack for folks, just to unpack the jargon of immunity debt, because I think a lot of people just when they hear that, they don't even know what it means and they just turn off. And what is this purported theory? Who is speaking of it? Just let's talk about it in real words with real
Okay,
words.
I will. Let me first just give you the sort of like brief summary of Article 3, and then I'll jump right in.
And you'll weave that in.
I'll jump right in, and we'll do like a deep dive on that, because that's really, really crucial to understand and also to debunk. So the third article was written in response to a very damaging, poorly researched article that came out in the New Republic, where the author clearly had an axe to grind, trying to proclaim that long COVID is essentially not real. You know, she did a little like both sidesism of,
Classic.
Yeah, like, oh, well, some people say they found biomarkers, but like, what if, then she used this case study of this woman who like, clearly did have psychological problems and like thought she had long COVID, but didn't. That case study is not representative. It's sort of like doing a huge profile of like a false rape accusation. We get angry when those things happen because there's no attention being put where it needs to be put, which is this rape culture, this crisis of sexual assault against women in this country and around the world. And then people choose to do this, big, huge story about how dangerous it is for men to falsely get accused, which like is much, 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 much rarer. So in this case, it's a decision to highlight something that is unrepresentative, to put forward a narrative that minimizes COVID. I also want to get in deeply about what long COVID is, because we know a lot about it, actually. So the framing, one thing to keep in mind when you see mysterious or we see really, really soft language like brain fog, which is actually code for neurocognitive decline, we need to keep in mind that is also minimizing language. We do have the information to know that this is a serious, serious illness. And as socialists, as leftists, it's our job to really be drawing attention to this. So that inspired me to write an article. Where the fuck is Jacobin? Where the fuck is Current Affairs? Where the fuck are these, lefty allies on this issue, which is ongoing, which is a crisis, which is the greatest mass tragedy of our time? They are writing articles about whether You've Got Mail, a movie that came out 20 years ago, is neoliberal. I don't have words for what a failure it is that you're publishing that and nothing about COVID. So we'll come back also to that. That's the topic of the third one, is why is the business press, and I'll dig into this as well, why is the business press out reporting the left on COVID? We have Forbes, Wall Street Journal, Fortune magazine.
And they often do.
Financial Times, they have fantastic long COVID coverage, even medical coverage. And the reason is they're worried about the economy. So it's extremely embarrassing that people on the right are more worried about us as workers than we are worried about each other as human beings. But let's get into immunity debt, because this is really,
it's just a word that goes around.
It's really dangerous. It's really dangerous. I've been calling it ivermectin for liberals, because it is pretty much the same thing that happened with ivermectin. You have a group of people who really, really want their political leaders to have been correct. You have a group of people who is listening to only a few mainstream media outlets. In the case of Trump supporters, they were only listening to Fox News. And in the case of liberals, we have a more diverse group of publications, but generally they're going for CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, and they all are sort of continuing to prop up this idea that COVID is over, even though it's never been over. And it's more of a crisis now, actually, than it's ever been before, because of the very, very low awareness or understanding of what's going on, the lack of protections, the lack of testing. We are actually in the most dangerous point of the pandemic, and that's something people really need to know. So immunity debt. We are now, for the first time, because we're a year out from having mass infected all of the children, potentially repeatedly. I believe it's 90% of all US children have had COVID. And many of them, I'm sure, have had it many times, because we insist on sending them back to these, cesspools of infection.
Incubation factories. Yeah.
Yes. And people are finally noticing there's something wrong. Like that mom I was telling you who wrote the article that's like, it's so weird. My kid has never been this sick. I saw another mom posting on Twitter yesterday, oh, well, no wonder my kid was feeling bad. We went to the ER. The doctor said he's never seen this before. They tested positive for 7 concurrent respiratory infections. That's not normal. That's not a kid with a normal immune system. And when I say it's not normal, I mean, the doctor said, I've never seen this before. That should be a red flag. That should be a big red flag that something is wrong. So we're starting to see the chickens come home to roost on the fact that there is immune damage done to your immune system after you have COVID. There's not a ton that we know about the long-term implications of this, but we do know that a disease that deletes T cells, that leaves you without naive T cells, that is harming really vital parts of your immune system, like CD4 cells, CD8 cells, and B cells. We know that this is extremely bad for you, and it really compromises your ability to fight off other infections. So there was a study, I want to get the name of the study right. There's been a ton of studies, to be honest. But in Nature Immunology, this made a lot of waves a month or so back. Immunological dysfunction persists for 8 months following initial mild to moderate SARS-CoV-2 infection. So I'm talking about even in mild to moderate cases, and I'm also talking about long-term effects. So the issue there, and I also want to side note, 8 months was the length of the study. The immune damage was not alleviated at the end of 8 months. That's just when the study ended. So to be clear, it's not like, oh, you have immune damage for 8 months and then you're fine. You have immune damage for God knows how fucking long, but at least 8 months. And the issue here is that our Let It Rip plan, which I've said over and over again, will not continue because it just fucking can't. And that's what the science says. Our Let It Rip plan is that your kids are going to get it every 4 to 6 months. So let's think about this. Their immune system has been compromised. 4 to 6 months later, well within the window that we know it's still compromised, they get COVID again. What do you think happens then? Their immune system is further damaged. We are really, really harming kids, and we are seeing it right now. So let's get into immunity debt, which is the ivermectin explanation. In order to try to continue to keep this train running, because it would mean acknowledging the severe effects of COVID would mean the Biden administration and everyone that let this happen is now on the hook for really, really massive, I would call them crimes against humanity, killing kids. I think that's bad. So they're just going to try to come up with anything else it could be. So when we look at what is getting blamed for these really, really noticeable changes, these really, really huge skyrocketing health issues, especially among people that have been continually exposed to COVID, there's only 2 things it could be, right? Because only 2 things have changed since 2020. One, a gigantic pandemic of a novel virus with unknown long-term implications. The other was sometimes we wore masks. So, and the vaccine. Those are 3. So you either have to blame COVID or you have to blame the interventions. And since they cannot blame COVID, they're defaulting to trying to pin everything on these interventions, which, by the way, is incredibly dangerous because you are creating social rejection of masks and vaccine. Do you understand what an asshole you have to be to inherit the Trump pandemic response, not only continue it, make it worse, take away protections, take away money, take away tests, and then turn the liberals against masks and vaccines? You inherited half of a country that was willing to take these measures, and you threw it out. You made it worse. I mean, it's way worse than it was under Trump, because now nobody's doing anything. Immunity debt is this idea that because the kids were so well protected for the last 2 years, because as we all know, every kid wore masks everywhere. They wore them playing with their friends. They wore them to school. They didn't take them off. They, they didn't do anything social because their parents were really protecting them. They didn't go travel for the holidays. They didn't eat indoors. They didn't do indoor dining. No, of course not. They were perfectly protected. So they didn't encounter any sort of pathogens. And because of that, that has made them much more sick. Let's unpack a few things that are wrong with this. Right off the bat, parents didn't do shit to protect their kids. Let me just start there. Some parents masked their kids consistently. Most parents I know kind of did it for a while, maybe in 2020, certainly not in 2021. And certainly not, they weren't banned from indoor dining. Maybe some people were in 2020, but again, that's 2 years ago. So you would expect to see an immunity debt effect taking hold in 2021. We'll also look, a really great case study is Sweden. So Sweden decided very early in the pandemic, we're going to do let it rip literally from day one. We don't care. We just got to get on with our lives. Indoor dining is more important than people, getting to live their lives. So they never did any restrictions of any kind. They're sort of like this experiment in herd immunity, because their idea was, we're going to get herd immunity, we're going to be fine. From an early point, we knew herd immunity could not be possible with COVID because of the way that it damages your immune system. And because of the way it evades and harms T cells, which are what you need to fight infections and to remember pathogens. They never did anything. And guess what they're having? Massive wave of children being hospitalized with RSV. And there is no possibility that that could be immunity debt. And there is only one other explanation, and it is post-COVID immune deficiency. I'll also dive in.
Which is quite the opposite.
Yes.
Which would do reverse immunity debt.
I'll also dive in a little bit. Actually, there's one graphic I also want to share here, which is a chart of showing this cohort of kids who were in the hospital with RSV. Essentially, what it shows is that this cohort, which I think is 6 to 12, I remember 6 to 12 months and then 12 to 24 months maybe, it shows not that they were protected from infection, but that this cohort of kids was very infected with COVID. And the spike in RSV cases pretty much matches exactly to the huge spike of COVID cases among children of this age. So it's right there, you have the correlation. But I do want to just backtrack and talk a little bit more about how immunity debt, even if it were applicable here, which it's not, does not exist. So the idea behind immunity debt was essentially a sort of corruption of the hygiene hypothesis. The hygiene hypothesis, which is controversial itself, says that if you encounter bacteria and which really just means good bacteria. It's basically the idea that let your toddler play in the dirt, because then they will encounter more bacteria and that helps their immune system over the long term. Few issues with this. One, there is a difference between microbes and pathogenic microbes. So microbes, might be found in the dirt, are not illnesses. What they're saying is that you should expose your kids to environmental bacteria that are not negative for them and not harmful to them. No doctor says, make sure you go out and give your kid every respiratory infection so they can be the most healthy. That's the complete opposite of reality. Additionally, again, microbes are not viruses. Respiratory viruses are pathogens, and you do not want to, the more that you contract them, the worse it is for you. As always, we don't want our kids sick. That should be obvious. The less sick you are, the less sick you are. The more sick you are, the more sick you are. We don't need to it's this weird, double speak of like, well, you have to get sick to not be sick. It makes absolutely no sense. I would also note with the strep A outbreak, that really throws a wrench in this so-called explanation, because you don't get immunity to strep. It's a bacteria. It's not like the flu, where if you got the flu, then a few weeks later you don't get the flu. It is something that you can get at any time, and that wouldn't explain the increased severity where children are actually dying of strep throat, many children dying of strep throat, and I assume that number is going to keep climbing, unfortunately. Lastly, about immunity debt, I want to say that it's a real shame that we're seeing New York Times and even Justin Trudeau, a few other people, starting to buy into this. That's where I say it crosses over into ivermectin territory, because I'm sure that they have the resources to know, that this isn't real. Any immunologist that you follow or ask for an explanation of this, they will just straight up tell you this was invented in 2021. It's not real. It's not a concept in immunology, and it's incredibly dangerous. And I think the reason it actually climbs well beyond ivermectin in terms of danger to the public, because ivermectin was really only believed by a small subset of people, and it was really only harming the people who were eating horse paste. This theory, the implications of it are absolutely so destructive. They're so destructive, because the implications are not only that it's fine to get COVID, but that it's actually good to get COVID, and that what hurts your children is doing basic measures to try to protect them from illness. This is essentially the state telling you, you must make your kids ill to make them healthy. And again, this is absurd on the face of it, but I think they are very much afraid to acknowledge that they may have harmed their own children. And I think that is something that is very hard psychologically to overcome. And it's much easier to just say, I heard about this thing, this immune debt thing. There was a piece, fortunately, we're starting to see more mainstream media debunk this. There was a piece in Salon yesterday. The title is, let me see if I can find it. Well, anyway, there's a big piece in Salon yesterday that essentially was just like, here's why immunity debt's a bunch of bullshit, and we interviewed a bunch of immunologists. There's one other thing I want to mention, just to kind of keep clear what we're talking about. There is a similarly named concept called the immunity gap that some other immunologists sort of have started using. The immunity gap is different from immunity debt, and does exist. Immunity debt implies that if you don't get strep A this year, if you get strep A next year, it's going to be really bad. We know that's not true, because most people don't get strep A every year. Most people don't get flu every year. Most people don't get RSV every year. It makes no sense to say that if you don't get RSV, flu, and strep every year, you're going to die of it next year. Of course, this is not true. But immunity gap is simply the idea that, yes, flu cases and RSV cases and these kind of things were low in 2020, somewhat low in 2021, although that's a little bit hinkier. Basically, in some places, RSV cases were actually higher in certain parts of Canada, at the point where tons and tons of kids were going to the hospital, which means that it was not the number of cases, it was the severity of cases that increased. I think at this point we now actually are well above with more and more cases, which isn't surprising. But looking at last year, it's not true that nobody got sick last year, and that's what's hard for me to understand about parents accepting this explanation, because I'm like, your kids did get sick last year. Everyone I know who has kids, their kids got sick in the last year. So how are you accepting this as like, oh, it's because my kids didn't get sick last year? You know they did. So who are you going to believe? Me or your own eyes? It's very weird. Immunity gap implies that we would have a double or triple cohort effect in the hospitals, meaning that because kids were somewhat protected from flu, more kids might be getting the flu. In that case, you might expect to see numbers that were more like double or even triple. But two things: you would not see increased severity. There's no reason why you would see increased severity. Secondly, not only would you not see increased severity, but in terms of how high these numbers are, it's well beyond 2 or 3 cohorts. I mean, that graph that I showed earlier, it's like nothing that's ever been seen before. I mean, that's like at least 10x. I don't know how high it's going to go, but it's still going up. And my own feeling, knowing what we know about COVID, is that not only are more children going to be dying of strep and of flu and of RSV and of every other, formerly mild disease under the sun because their immune systems are damaged. But we are going to see our hospitals overwhelmed this winter like never before, because we also have a gigantic COVID wave incoming with not a mask in sight, not a mandate in sight. Nobody knows what's going on. And it is a complete failure of the left to not have even slightly tried to push back on the normalization of mass death.
Do you have any hope in I don't exactly even know you're looking at it from much closer than I am, but New York, I saw, was recommending not only masks indoors, but even in outdoor crowded situations. Is this the first kind of
it's
health
a domino
department who is thinking about this even? I hadn't heard anyone else even talking about it.
It's a domino, but then again, actually LA was the first. So LA, I think, is actually going to reinstate indoor masks because they have, they made this really ridiculous change to the way we were tracking COVID cases over at the CDC, where under the prior map, 94% of all counties right now would need to be under mask mandate. And now it's like, 10 to 20% of counties are starting to get into the high case territory. But you have to understand that what used to be high case levels is now a low case, according to the CDC. So they're gaslighting you. They gave you a completely different map. But even with that crazy map, which has this crazy high threshold for masks to be introduced, they've passed. They passed it in LA. They passed it in New York. And keep in mind, these cases are drastically underreported at this point. So in LA, yes, they're probably going to bring the mask mandate back because they've crossed into high transmission territory. In New York, they're dragging their feet. What they put out was merely a recommendation. It is not a mandate, and what is needed is a mandate. Mandates are very effective. So many people, and let me just say one thing to you people, grow the fuck up. So many people will wear a mask if it's the rule, and they won't wear a mask if other people around them aren't wearing a mask, because apparently they're really concerned about peer pressure way more than children dying. And honestly, again, grow the fuck up, man up, wear a fucking mask. Like we're in such a crisis, and the bare minimum you can fucking do is wear a mask. I'm not asking for anything super drastic. Like, I know these people are still going to indoor dine. I'm not, but a lot of people are going to. I know these people aren't going to make any kind of massive lifestyle changes, but when you're in the grocery store, when you're on public transit, you are, let me say this in no uncertain terms, you are participating in making it impossible for disabled, vulnerable, and elderly people to be in public spaces. If you are on the metro and someone needs to get to their doctor's appointment who has cancer or who has a kid with cancer, you are making it impossible for them not to get exposed in those environments. As leftists, the bare minimum we can do is to wear a high quality, that means N95 or KN95 fitted mask in public spaces where we know that disabled people are. I saw recently someone saying, well, you can choose to wear a mask if you're going to be around disabled people or immune compromised people. Let me tell you something. 25% of all Americans are disabled or immunocompromised, and every single person in this country knows someone or interacts with someone who is. And not only that, every single day when you get on the metro, unless you're doing a huge medical history of every single person you encounter, I guarantee you there's someone on that train that should not be contracting COVID. So do your part, stop complaining, and shut the entire fuck up. Because quite frankly, wearing a mask is easy. It's not hard. And I know a lot of people also just aren't up to date on what COVID is doing, and that's why they're not masking. And I understand that. And I hope that you'll get up to date with what's going on. You don't have to trust me. Just look at the medical literature, and you'll make the decision to protect your neighbors. But if you know that information and you're still choosing to say, well, me not wearing a mask is more important than you being able to visit your doctor or your kid with cancer to not get exposed to COVID, you're not on the left. You have no place in this movement.
Well, I mean, we're, besides being on the left, we are also international. I believe the right wing calls us globalists, whatever it is, but we are people who are concerned international solidarity. And you are specifically someone who's following these things. You talked about the business press coverage of COVID. What about the international press's coverage of China's reaction to COVID?
That's a shame.
Especially in the last week where we have seen some movement.
It's a shame. It's really a shame because I believe that China made the decision it made because of the long-term immune damage effects that we have seen documented since 2020.
Which is continuing to pursue zero COVID.
Right. I want to be clear that this is not new findings. We have known since 2020 that this is damaging immune systems. It's really a shame because they're being bullied out of it by the entire international community because capitalism we must have grist for the mill, and we just couldn't leave them alone. We couldn't leave them alone. And they're definitely loosening up pretty significantly. I mean, they still have a lot more in place than we do, but I think there was a quote from him yesterday that was like, it doesn't matter how right we are. If the people want to jump into the fire, we have to follow. And, I think
I hadn't saw that. That's an interesting quote, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just shows
there's only so much power we have.
I think it shows that they are actually responsive to the public in a way that it's been completely misrepresented over here, that people didn't want to do any lockdowns. Of course, there were issues with lockdowns. Of course, it's hard to be in quarantine. People don't like being in quarantine. Usually, when quarantines are implemented, historically, you don't do a public approval poll about that because it's an issue of security and national health. The fact that
I would say things coming out of the BBC, the New York Times were astonishing, though, right? Like they would have multiple stories on someone who wasn't able to see their dog or something, like these sort of really cloying human interest stories that were meant to undermine the idea of zero COVID policy. And I don't even mean this last month. I mean,
the entire time,
many months.
The entire time. Yeah. One of the most really obvious pieces of propaganda I saw was in the New York Times. I always just shudder when I see talk of the deadly zero COVID policy or the,
Yeah, exactly.
Say that again, man, slowly, because we've killed 1.1 million people in this country. And you're talking about incidents where 5 to 10 people died. Those things are tragic. In no way have they committed mass murder of their own citizens like we have. And the fact that you continue, they were repeating that there was a protest chant in China that they want to go to the movies, which I don't know if it's true or not. You want to know who else hasn't been to the movies in 3 years? Me. Because I can't. Because there's an out-of-control raging pandemic that if you go to the movies and you contract it, you are at very high risk for vascular events. You are at very high risk for post-COVID immune deficiency. You are at very high risk for damage done to your endothelium and microclots in your blood, which we can get into later. That's not a functioning society. That's a society where you are purposely mass infecting everybody. You're not protecting them. It won't continue this way, but to think that we're on the right track, seeing the kind of sickness, the level of sickness that we're already seeing this early in the season, it's just absurd on its face. But yes, so the worst propaganda I saw was they did a piece where there was a bus who was transporting some ill people to COVID quarantine, which again is where they take patients, give them medical care, and isolate them from the rest of society, which is generally what you want to do with a level 3 pathogen. And the bus crashed, and some of the people on the bus died. And the whole article was China's COVID policy is so deadly. They should be rethinking it because of this bus crash. And to me, I was like, that's like saying a school bus crashed in the US, so we should rethink sending kids to school. That literally has nothing to do. That's an accident, a tragic accident. Literally nothing to do with the fact that they've saved about 6 million people at this point. I think if they had our death rate, it would be 4 to 5 million. Actually, not to oversell. Only 4 to 5 million deaths have been averted so far. So yeah, fuck them.
Walk us through these last two graphs that you thought were illustrative for us in this moment.
Okay, hold on. Let me pull this up real quick. I think we do need to get a little into the heart attack.
Time, so So I think definitely get into the, let's talk about, I mean, no reason not to talk about that right now if you don't want to. I think, when we're saying that you are left weaker, I think there's a very specific ways that are helpful and evocative for people to understand what that actually means.
Okay.
And I think these mini clots definitely, at least they reach me.
Okay.
When people start talking about them, I'm like, oh, okay.
So let's do two more little deep dives, and we may go a little bit over, but I think it's really crucial to get this information into people's heads, into their ears, to at least giving them a jumping off point of what we're looking at. So first I want to talk about long COVID. Long COVID has been portrayed as like, what is it? Is it fatigue? No. At this point we've studied it so much. We know what it looks like. We know what the biomarkers are. So here are some of the biomarkers they've been able to find and are now able to look at. Unfortunately, these are not routine tests. So a lot of the issue is that long COVID patients go to a doctor, they go to specialists, they go to the ER, and they say, hey, we did all the normal tests, we didn't find anything, so you're fine. Meanwhile, long COVID patients are like not able to walk down the street. They're like fainting randomly. Many of them are bedbound. And people are accusing them of this being psychological because there's a long history of doing that with chronic illness in this country, sort of attributing it to you must be crazy. I think the one silver lining here is that it's just so many people who have this now that it's becoming undeniable. Of course, all these people didn't randomly go crazy, especially because most of the people contracting this, they're not worried about COVID. They don't think they're going to get long COVID. It's not like there was any sort of like psychological trigger that they're like looking
right, the
out.
hypochondriacs aren't getting
no,
long COVID.
I'm not getting it.
Masked.
Yeah. But so here's some of the things they found. There is significant damage to the endothelium, which is the lining of your blood vessels. And if you're wondering whether I'm pissed that I had to learn that because I didn't even like high school biology, yes, I fucking am. I don't want to be learning any of this stuff. But because the endothelium is damaged, which again means that all throughout your body, your blood vessels are now damaged, not functioning properly. The way the body attempts to heal that is by clotting, so increasing the clotting factor in your blood, because because usually if you have a cut or an injury, it's like, okay, we'll just clot this. The issue is you can't repair the endothelium with blood clots, and instead what happens is these tiny clots just build up and build up. This causes so many issues. So for one thing, capillary rarefaction, that's when basically your capillaries just don't work anymore. So this is decreasing blood flow throughout the body, including in the brain, including in the lungs, including in the extremities. And that is one of the things that leads to that constant fainting, fatigue, exhaustion. They have very poor circulation. Another thing that happens with the microclots is that they actually can develop into larger clots as they sort of like stick onto each other. So we're seeing a huge spike in DVT, deep vein thrombosis, a huge spike in all kinds of vascular effects. So that includes heart attacks, strokes, blood clots, and heart disease, heart failure. All of these things are being brought on during post-COVID. Actually, I have the numbers here about the your risk of heart attack, how much it goes up after a COVID infection. And I want to be clear that this is actually not just long COVID.
And pulmonary too. Yeah.
Pulmonary, yes, there is also pulmonary damage. It's a multi-organ disease. So when I say it's having these vascular effects, keep in mind, it's having effects on every organ. So we have spiking cases of liver disease, kidney disease, also of diabetes. So, and of cancers, which goes back to the suppressed immune system. So 30 days, between 30 days and a year after, this is a recent study, between 30 days and a year after recovery from COVID, even in mild cases, survivors were 52% more likely to have a stroke, 63% more likely to have a heart attack, and 72% more likely to develop heart failure. So some of these people who are having these heart effects may or may not have symptoms of ongoing COVID. So like post-COVID symptoms, long COVID symptoms. We're not sure why some people seem to have like the microclotting effect, and why some people just seem to be fine and then they just drop dead of a stroke or a heart attack. I want to sidebar on the strokes and heart attacks and say that this is really well beyond debate. We know for sure that it drastically spikes your risk of vascular event at least a year following COVID. And what we're seeing is we are seeing that reflected in the excess mortality data. So in Australia, they just came out and said their excess mortality is 13% higher than pre-pandemic levels. And they're like, we can't fully explain it because it's not all COVID does. I can explain it. It is the post-COVID effects, including heart attacks, strokes, cancers, diabetes, and liver failure, kidney failure, everything. But actually, in that article, I want to also stress that 13% is not a normal. It's not a normal just like variation. What they said in the article was that 1 to 2% is the most they've ever seen, and like the highest is, you know, like the worst flu season ever. It was a 2% excess mortality. So it's actually, along with the business press, it's the actuaries that are really ringing the bells here. It's just the book pusher, like accountant people who are like, this data is really fucking weird. So like it's, you know, strange times and strange bedfellows, but that is where we're getting that data, is from like life insurance employees that are like, our life insurance company is going to go out of fucking business because everyone's dying at a very early age. Sorry, let me circle back to the heart and blood issues. So I did want to share a photo that shows what blood in a post-COVID, long COVID patient looks like. So in this photo, you'll see this is shared by Dr. Wes Ely, who's an ICU doctor at Vanderbilt. He's also an expert who studies COVID and long COVID. He's been sharing images like this for awareness. This is a patient who is actually on anticoagulants at the time that their blood was taken. And you can see that it's incredibly tacky and sticky, which, indicates that there's this high level of clotting in their blood. So a disease that turns your blood into glue is not a cold, it's not a flu. This has nothing to do with those things. And you don't want to get it. And specifically, to head right into that other chart, you don't want to get it multiple times. So the last chart I want to show you is, this is a recent study where this has been confirmed a few times, but this was a really big study where they showed that your risk of any negative outcome, that includes hospitalization, long COVID, heart attack, stroke, anything that could happen post-COVID, it increases, and of course death, it increases with each infection. This is the opposite of what we would see with a typical disease like a flu or a cold. If you were to contract something you've already had, you have some immunity built up. I think if I were to name one piece of misinformation that's been absolutely central to constructing this completely unscientific COVID response, it's that I believe that Biden and the people around him do not understand at this point that herd immunity is not possible. Long-term immunity is not possible. Hybrid immunity, not possible. Natural immunity, not possible. This is a disease that attacks your T cells. It attacks your ability to be able to fight future pathogens, including COVID in the future. So when you get that second infection, your risk of a worse outcome is now higher. When you get that third infection, it's higher than it was for the second infection.
And the sooner the worse, yeah.
And so on and so on. But I just really need everyone to hold a couple of concepts in their head right now to really understand why I say let it rip will not continue. I don't say that in the sense that it's bad, it's negative, we should organize against it, it's immoral. All those things are true. I say it in the sense that the science and the math says we will not continue doing it because it's just not possible for society to run this way. So essentially, what I'm saying is COVID carries a very high risk of contracting long COVID. Right now, we think it's somewhere between 10 to 20%. I want to also stress that we are still really unclear about who actually has long COVID and who doesn't. It may be that long COVID is merely the presence of viral persistence. So when we think of viral persistence, you want to think of HIV or HPV. These are things you contract. They don't cause problems at first. Later down the road, they cause very severe health outcomes. In the case of HIV, it causes acquired immune deficiency syndrome. In the case of COVID, what we're seeing, not only all of these risk of organ failure, multi-system effects, we're seeing something similar to what happens when people develop acquired immune deficiency. We're seeing, because that virus is persisting in your organs, the same way HIV does, where the immune system cannot get to it. The immune system is activated. It knows there's a pathogen in the body, and it goes around trying to fight everything, which leads to autoimmunity, but it can't find what it actually needs to find, the virus it actually needs to clear. In doing so, you ultimately destroy your immune system. That is what happens in long-term HIV infection. You end up exhausting. It's called T cell exhaustion. Your T cells are now exhausted, so you can't fight off anything. So I want to be clear. I think that people will find it extremely scary, and also they'll probably just dismiss it as fear-mongering. Again, I would encourage you to do this reading yourself instead of just assuming it's fine. I want to be really clear that while we don't know the number of people who have viral persistence, and we don't know the amount to which they may be able to clear that virus at some point, that's what happens with HPV, so that's a hope. But when we're making public policy, and I'm talking about a disease that has the potential to persist in your blood, cause long-term immune derangement, which leaves you completely unable to fight other pathogens, we must take the worst case scenario as our starting point, because if we don't, we cannot afford to be wrong about this. And we're just leaning into like, well, hopefully it's not true. That's not public policy. That's not scientific. What we are seeing right now completely bears out that this immune damage is very, very real.
So Bolsonaro, you're saying, is not going to be a healthy man.
He is certainly not going to be a healthy man. No. So sorry. Sorry. I must wrap up my point. Let me just say this. Hold a few thoughts in your head right now. COVID is very, very, very contagious, very, very, very common. And right now the game plan is for you and your children to get it 2 to 3 times every year, which, by the way, is way too much. Even if it didn't cause long-term effects, I would not want to have COVID 3 times a year. But it does. COVID causes long-term effects, which are extremely scary and which we do not fully understand, but we at least know that it leaves you vulnerable to other infections. 3, every single time you get COVID, your risk of poor outcome goes up, your immune system is further damaged, and you are more at risk for a worse outcome. So when you think about those 3 ideas at once, explain to me what the long-term strategy is here, because even these motherfuckers who are healthy after having COVID once or twice, that doesn't mean shit. Your risk is going up with each infection. How does the economy function when every single person in the country, multiple times every year, moves further and further toward disabling illness, hospitalization, poor outcome, and long-term damage to their immune system, not to mention their vascular system and their heart? It doesn't add up. And that is the bottom line. I think people really have trouble accepting it because it means we're going to have to make a lot of changes, and they don't want to do that. So, the one thing people have been defaulting to recently is it's the vaccine. It's the vaccine. I really can't stress enough how many studies confirm it's not the vaccine. And if you're unvaccinated, these effects are way worse, not better. Like, I've seen a few crazy people on Twitter saying vaccinated people aren't dying. Well, they're dying. They're dying at a much higher rate. Unvaccinated. Both of them are dying. Unvaccinated people are dying. Vaccinated people are dying.
Yes.
Unvaccinated people, proportionally to how many people there are in the population, die much more frequently, including of these heart effects. But there was recently an anti-vaxxer documentary that came out called Died Suddenly. And it was documenting all of these sudden deaths that are happening.
The name's a little on the nose, I have to say.
Yeah, sure. We can all be art house directors. But it was documenting all of these heart attack strokes that we know are happening. And the rebuttal in the press was just like, oh, this isn't real. That's not helpful. You are pouring gasoline on anti-vaxxers by not coming out and saying, no, it is not the vaccine. It is COVID. It is post-COVID. We know for a fact that your risk of heart attack and stroke goes up significantly after each COVID infection, that is what needs to be the headline. Because they're not willing to admit their failures or to start attracting attention to the fact that COVID never ended and that we're in a worse position than ever, they're just letting this anti-vax stuff go wild. So they would much rather the entire public become anti-vaxxers than that we stop showing up to work and purposely reinfecting ourselves with this illness, because that is less disruptive to them.
And I mean, look, and it's a small public. I'm a humble public relations man, so just to add to the politics on the bottom of this horrible policy outcome is the fact that we have made a kind of wellness anti-vax alliance a permanent political faction and force for no reason. We've created a real dangerous monster that is interesting in America, in the kind of California, Marianne Williamson kind of, neck of the whatever, but is also interesting here in Europe, very specifically in places like Austria and southern Germany and places where we've talked to our guests about eco-fascism and things. This is actually feeding that fire.
I think, I had parents who used to be very pro-vax, liberal parents messaging me, I heard the vaccine causes heart attacks. I don't really understand the mindset where you just hear that and you don't look into it at all, but apparently
that doesn't sound that.
Yeah.
Not only does that not sound right, it sounds like everything everyone's ever said that's super
But
wrong.
I did send her a bunch of studies that are like, here's, that there is a low risk of myocarditis, which is a mild outcome in some young men, and that risk is 9 times higher for post-COVID. So if your options are get the vax or get COVID, get the fucking vax, man. Get the fucking vax. So, and get boosted. Oh, one other really crucial piece of information for people to know. These issues that I'm talking about, where COVID is good at attacking and evading T cells, it is interfering with the vaccine's long-term effectiveness. So when we first got vaccinated, the hope was that it would give us antibodies, but then it would also start to build T cell memory, T cell immunity that would give us long, durable protection against COVID. 2 things have happened since then that have continued to decrease the efficacy of the vaccine. One is because of the completely uncontrolled spread of this disease. We have new variants popping up left, right, and center. Every few days there's a new one. Right now we're heading into a new wave with 5 new dominant variants. BQ11, BQ1, and XBB, which is completely resistant to every monoclonal because we've continued to let it spread and mutate around the tools that we once had. And so that is one thing that has compromised the efficacy of the vaccine. We did get the new booster. You should get it. You must get it. Get it. That's the bivalent booster. It is formulated for strains up to BA.5, and it came out right at the end of the BA.5 wave. It's not formulated for the new strains, so it's kind of effective. It's certainly a lot better than the first shot. And this is the other thing we need to talk about is the really, really rapid waning of these shots. So what we found is that while they do induce an antibody response, just like infection, it does not induce that T cell response we were supposed to see. And we do think this has to do with its ability to hide from T cells and mess with T cells. So what that means is if you look at the CDC's own vaccine efficacy data, what you'll see is they looked at, before 2 weeks after vaccination where it's not fully kicked in, and then 2 weeks to 4 months, which is when it's the most effective, and then after 4 months. And in the case of people who had received a 3rd booster, so this is even beyond the first 2 shots, which most people never even got 1 booster. 4 months after you have received your first booster, your 3rd shot, your risk of hospitalization is reduced 29% versus an unvaccinated person. That's 4 months. Most people haven't had a vaccine in 2 years. So what I am saying to you is that given the rapid waning of antibody protection, people who were vaccinated a year or 2 ago are essentially unvaccinated. So when I say we're going into a winter that's going to be a lot worse than any other winter, I'm not merely saying that because we don't have protections and masks. I'm saying that because the vast majority of people in this country don't know it's a risk, don't know they're at risk, and don't know their vaccine doesn't work for shit anymore because they got it 2 years ago. So yeah, prepare for a winter where you're not going to be able to access healthcare. Stay safe, wear a mask, get a HEPA filter, do all of the basic things that can protect you from these illnesses and protect your children from these illnesses, because you are not going to want to be the guinea pig that is dealing now with the effects that may persist for the rest of your life.
And if I could add one more thing onto your list, I would say also subscribe to the Gauntlet Substack newsletter, where Julia Doubleday, the show's own, will be providing you with the facts and the figures. She is reading many things, so that you only have to read a few things.
Thank you. Yes.
And you'll come back and you'll talk to us soon. We don't know when and how that will all be, but, especially now that you're putting out this regular content, it's sort of like me with these movie reviews I do. It's like you have to make it into multiple kinds of content.
Sure,
right?
yeah.
So
I mean, I have a few.
If you're already writing something, even just speaking it out loud into a video is helpful.
I have a few friends who absolutely refuse to read. So I'll send them this. I'll be like,
so
this is basically
when the article comes in. Well, you'll come back on. We'll do this. I'll do a quick review of something else.
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll see what happens. But this was fun, and it was nice to see you, even though it's bad news and we're all going to die.
Yeah, pretty much.
The committee program still feels like a comfortable, happy place where ideas are expressed before they fall right outside the camera range and onto the ground.
Indeed. Well, thank you for having me and giving me the platform to talk a little bit about all of this. It's good to be able to do that. And I think we covered a lot of ground. There's a few other things we didn't get to, and I'll save it for the next one.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.